And of course, I can now choose to register my account. That workflow will run. And now it's redirected me through to my settings page in my application, just like I had created within my workflows. Hello, my name is Lachlan Kirkwood, and today I'll be teaching you how to build your own user registration and login experience entirely out of no code using Bubble. While each of my tutorials walks through this process, I wanted to create a dedicated video that just allows me to explain this to you in as much detail as possible. Let's open up a Bubble editor, and I can start walking you through the process. Over in my Bubble editor here, I've just created a sample version of a home page. And at the top of my page, I've just created a group here with a few different headings as well as 2 buttons within the top right hand corner. And these are of course our login or sign up buttons that we'll be using to register user accounts. And essentially, whenever one of these buttons is clicked, what I'd like to do is create an experience that displays a pop-up in the middle of our page, which will include the necessary fields for a user to add information like their email and password to either register for an account or log into their existing account. And so as I mentioned, the first thing I'll be using is what's called a pop-up element. So if I scroll on down to the containers menu in the left-hand side of our page here, I'm going to select to add a pop-up onto our page. And I can drag this pop-up wherever I'd like on this page because it will automatically center it within our application. And as you can see right now, the pop-up is just overlaid on top of our page. And this is actually how it's going to function in our application. And so before we start adding elements onto this pop-up, I'm first of all just going to update the name of this because I'd like this to be the pop-up we use for our sign up workflow. So I'm going to be calling this pop-up sign up. And that will just allow us to differentiate between the 2 separate pop-ups that we'll be adding into our application. And now we can start adding in the elements and input fields we'll need for a user to sign up or register a new account in our application. So I'm going to scroll on up to our visual elements and first of all choose to add in a text element into this pop-up. And I'll have this text be a heading that'll be displayed in the center of our pop-up. And this will just display the words register a new account. And while we're here, what I'm going to do is just update the style of this just to be the default H2 dark heading that Bubble provides. I'm also then just going to remove the style, in which it'll keep the current formatting of our H2 heading. But the one thing I'd like to change is that I'd like to center this within the element itself. I can then just reduce the height of that element, and I might just move that across because I'd also like to close off some of this width of my pop-up. And then I can choose to right click on this heading and choose to center that horizontally in the middle of our pop-up. And I might just move that up a tad as well so there's not as much empty space at the top of our pop-up there. And then after adding in our heading, I'm going to choose to add in another text field, and this will just be a subheading. And so when it comes to registering a user's account, the information I'd like to store is going to be pretty minimal. In my case, I'm just going to store their name, their email address, and their password. Because after they've registered an account, I'd like to redirect them through to a settings page where they can update all of the information stored within their account. And so for this heading here, I'm just going to be calling this name. And then I'm just going to choose to bold the style of this heading. So I'm going to open up our rich text editor here, highlight this text and choose to bold the formatting of it. I will then also just move this up a tad there. And then below our text element here, I'm going to add in an input field to allow a user to add in their actual name that they would like to store within their account. And so if I scroll on down under our input forms here, I'm going to choose to add in our very first input field. I will drag this out across our pop-up and I'll be updating the name of this to be called input name, because when I create a workflow in a moment, I'd like to easily be able to reference which particular input will be storing data within the relevant data field in my database. And then once I've added in the input field here for the user's name, I could copy both the input field and the actual heading I will make a duplicate of that and I'll drag this down on our pop-up here, and I'll be updating the title of this field to be called email, because this is where I'll allow a user to register the email address. And so I'm going to then click on our input field, and I'm going to update the name of this to be called input email. And what I'm actually going to need to do is update the content format of this input field, because it's currently set to register a text property, whereas in this case I'd like it to register an email property, which just means that Bubble will validate that the field that's added in will need to be structured like an email. So it'll need to finish in things like @outlook.com or even @gmail.com. And then after I've added in that input field, I'm going to make one last copy of my heading and my input field here. I'm going to drag these down, and then I'll be updating the name of our last heading here to be called password. And then of course I'll need to update the name of the input field to also be called password. And in this instance, I'll be updating the content format to be a password, which just means that Bubble's going to hide whatever characters are added into this field. I might also just move this up a tad so it has relatively the same amount of space between the input fields and headings above it there. And then finally, the last thing I can do is just add in a button on our pop-up. So I'm going to scroll on up, and of course this button will be used to trigger our first workflow to register a user's account within our database. So I'm going to drag this button out, and I will update the text that's displayed in this button to say the word register, because a user will be registering a new account. I'm also going to remove the style of this button because I'd like to make a few quick changes. And the first is that I'm going to update the color of this button just to be my personal orange color code that I always use. And I'll also update the roundness to be 20, so that way it has some curved borders. If I would like, I could also right click and center that horizontally within my pop-up here. And now that's all of the input fields we'll need to add within our pop-up. I might just quickly close off some of the width of this pop-up so there's not as much empty space between the borders and the input fields. And then finally, I can also just close off some of the empty space at the bottom. I will be adding one additional text element down there in a moment. But for the time being, I'd just like to explain how we can now actually register a user's account every single time this button is clicked. And so I'm going to select our register button here, and then choose to start a workflow every single time this element is clicked. And within this workflow, what I'm going to want to do is head to our account tab here, and I'll be choosing from the first option, which allows me to sign the user up. And now within this workflow step, we'll just need to match the data fields in our database with the relevant input fields stored on our pop-up form. And so now when it comes to actually registering a user's account in our database, I would just like to open up our data tab and quickly just zoom on in so I can show you that by default, Bubble will automatically add in a user data type to any application that you create. And within this data type, it's already going to have a pre-built field, which is the email field. So you won't need to add that within your database. It is also going to automatically store a password field by default, but you just won't be able to see that within plain text. So that just means that you actually don't need to create a password field. What I would like to do though is, because I'm registering a user's name throughout our registration process, I'm just going to add in another data field called name. And this will just be a text field type because I just want to store a user's name in our database. I will create that. And now if I jump back into our workflow tab here, I'm just going to zoom back out there. What I can do is now register the relevant input fields on our page with the data fields that match it in our database. So for every user account that's created, I want the email field in our database to match the same value as the input email field on our pop-up. And then for the password, I'd like the password field in our database to be the value of our input password on our pop-up. And now that's all we'll need to add when it comes to registering a user's email and password credentials. And now what I would like to do is also register another field in our database for this user that's going to store their name in an account. And so what I love about Bubble is that you can choose to register any additional fields you would like within this user's account upon creation. So I'm going to choose that I'd like to register the name data field in my database to be the same value as the input name field on my page. And by all means, if you'd like to register any additional information for a user in the registration process, you just need to add as many different fields as you would like to match the fields you have stored in your database. And this is actually all you'll need to add within this step of our workflow. What I would like to do within this workflow though is just add one additional step. So as it stands right now, if a user was on our application and they just registered a new account, that workflow would run in our database and it would successfully create an account for them, but nothing would actually change on our page. Whereas what I'd like to do is redirect this user through to a dedicated settings page within my application to allow them to update all of the information that we need within their account. And so over in my application here, I've just created a previous settings page that I would like to use. So as you can see, this is just a generic page that stores some additional information like a user's profile photo or their address. And so what I'd like to do is add an additional step into my workflow. So if I jump back to my home page here, open up my workflow editor and open the only workflow that we've created where we're signing a new user's account up, I can add in an additional step here. So once a user has successfully registered a new account, I'd like to select from a navigation event because I want to redirect them through to our settings page. So I'm going to choose the go to page option and I'll just be sending them through to the settings page that I had created within my application. Obviously, if you're using a brand new application, you won't have as many pages as I have here, but I'm just going to be sending them through to my settings page. And I actually won't need to worry about sending any data through to that page for the time being. But that is all we'll need to do when it comes to actually building out the workflow to register a new user's account. If we head back into the design tab of our homepage though, the first thing you'll notice is that our pop-up element is currently not being displayed. And that's because the way pop-ups work in Bubble is that they're only displayed when you build a workflow to actually call them. And so if we were to head to our elements tree over here, I can see that my pop-up is currently being hidden because that's how it's going to look by default every single time this page is loaded. If I was to select the eye icon, however, it's going to just display this pop-up on our page. But of course, one thing I want to note is we're actually going to need to build out a workflow to display this pop-up every single time the sign up button is clicked here. And it's actually a pretty straightforward process. What we're going to do is just double click our sign up button here and we'll choose to start a workflow every single time our button is clicked. And within this workflow, what I'd like to do is just show our pop-up element. So if we scroll on down to the element actions option here, you'll see the very first option allows us to show an element. And the element I would like to show is our pop-up sign up. And now if I was to preview the application for our homepage here, what you'll see is that if I select the sign up button, that workflow will now run and it will display our registration pop-up. And now in order to close a pop-up, you can either create a workflow, which we'll be doing in a moment, but you can also just click away and it will hide that pop-up from the page. And the reason I mention that is because we're now going to need to create a separate pop-up in our page here. That's of course displayed if a user wants to log in, not register a new account. And then eventually I'd also like to create an experience that allows people to toggle between both the different pop-ups. And so if I close my preview here, I'd like to jump back into my design tab and I'm going to open up our pop-up sign up that we had previously just added. Because what I'm going to do here is just choose to make a copy of this element. I'm then going to close it and then paste in the copied version. And now you'll see in our elements tree here that we have a copied version of our sign up pop-up. What I'd like to do though is just update the name of this to be called pop-up login. So that way I can tell it apart from my previous pop-up. And then on this pop-up, I'm just going to need to make a few changes to the input fields that are displayed. So for our title here, I'm just going to update this text to display login to an account. And now when a user logs into an existing account, they'll only be required to use both their email and password. We won't need to register their name. So what I'm going to do is actually delete the name heading and the field here. I'm then going to select the rest of our fields and move these up on our pop-up. And now for our button element, I'm just going to update this to display the text login. And now what I'd like to do is create a separate workflow that runs every single time our login button is clicked that actually now logs the user in. So I'm going to choose to start a workflow whenever this button is clicked here. And within this workflow, I'm going to once again select from our account option here. Only this time, instead of signing the user up, I'm just going to choose to log the user in. And as I'd mentioned, in this case, we only need to reference the user's existing email address and password. And so I'm going to need to match the input field with the user's email with the relevant field in our database. And then also the exact same thing for our password field. One thing I would just like to do though before I build out this workflow is update the names of the input elements on our second pop-up here. So these are both still currently called input email and input password. And so when I need to reference these input fields in my workflow, I might just get confused between the existing input email field on my registration pop-up. So what I'm going to do is just add an additional word onto the name of this input to be called input email login. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing for my password field. It's going to be called input password login. And now if I jump back into my workflow, what I can do is now reference those fields quite easily. So for the email field, I want this to be the input email login field. And then for the password, this will be the input password login field. And now by default, I'd also just like to leave this option ticked as yes, which just keeps the user logged in once they've signed into our application. And now within this workflow, the only last step I'll need to add is just a way to automatically close this pop-up by default once a user clicks the login button. And then that will just return them to the home page that they were on. And so the way I can manually close this pop-up is just by adding an additional step here, choosing from the element actions. And instead of showing an element, I'm just going to click to hide an element. And in this case, the element I'll be hiding is our pop-up login. And of course, because we're hiding an element, I'm also going to need a way to show this element in the first place. So I'm going to select from our login button here, and I'll choose to create a workflow every single time that's clicked. And in this case, similar to before, I'm going to head to our element actions and I'll choose to show a pop-up. And the pop-up I'd like to display is of course the pop-up login. And now we have a way to display both of our pop-ups whenever they're needed. But the very last feature I'd just like to create and walk you through is how we can build an experience that allows users to switch between both pop-ups. So let's say a user clicks the sign up button, but then they realize that they've already previously created an account before. What I'd like to do is display some text at the bottom of our pop-up that when clicked hides this current registration pop-up and then displays our login pop-up. And then of course I'd like to create a similar experience on our second pop-up as well. And so in order to do that, I'm just going to add a text element into our pop-up here. And for our registration pop-up, I'm just going to display the text, already have an account, question mark, login. I can see I just need to add the question mark in and fix up the formatting there. And then for the style of this text, I'm just going to remove the default style here, just because I'd like to center that within the element here. And then I'm going to right click on the element itself and center that horizontally within our pop-up. And now if a user determines that they would like to log into an existing account, we're going to need to create a workflow to not only hide this pop-up, but then show our login pop-up. So I'm going to start a workflow every single time this text is clicked here. And within this workflow, as I mentioned, the first thing I'll need to do is hide the registration pop-up that they're currently viewing. So we'll select from our element actions and choose to hide an element. The element in this case will be our pop-up sign up. And then from here, I'm going to need to add an additional step and choose to show our login pop-up. So I'm going to head to our element actions, choose to show a pop-up, and this will be our pop-up login. And now from here, I'm just going to need to create the same experience on our separate pop-up. So I'm just going to copy this text here, close our registration pop-up, open up our login pop-up, select the pop-up itself and paste that text in. I'm just going to drag this down then. And I'll just be updating the text to display don't have an account, question mark, register here. And of course, I will just right click on this element, center that horizontally within my pop-up, move that up a tad, and then I'll be creating a workflow every single time this text is clicked. And within this, I'm going to head to our element actions. I'll be needing to hide this pop-up first. So I'll be hiding our login pop-up, and then I will be showing our registration pop-up. So our pop-up sign up. And then if I just jump back into my design tab, I just want to close off the empty space within our pop-up here. And that is actually the last little feature we'll need to create in order to make this whole registration feature functional. Let's jump on over into our bubble development environment, and I just want to show you a quick preview as to how this all functions. So over in my bubble development environment here, I'm going to select the login button here. And what you'll now see is that our login pop-up will be displayed. But of course, at this point in our tutorial, I haven't yet created a new account. So I'm going to need to select our text here to register a new account. And what you'll see is that our login pop-up will be hidden, and then our registration pop-up will be displayed. In which case, I'm going to then add in my details. So I'm going to call myself test user. I'll add in just an email address, and you'll see when I click away that because we had formatted that as an email field, Bubble is going to validate that that is the proper structure of an email address. And then if I'd like to add in a password, I can do so, and it's going to hide those characters. And of course, I can now choose to register my account. That workflow will run. And now it's redirected me through to my settings page in my application, just like I had created within my workflows. And just like that, we've finished creating our own user registration and login experience. As you can see, it's never been easier to do this using Bubble's no-code platform. And that's all I want to cover throughout today's tutorial. Of course, if you'd like to catch any other Bubble tutorials, I'd recommend hitting the subscribe button below to stay in touch with any other tutorials and guides that I publish on my YouTube channel. Until then though, I wish you all of the best on your own no-code journey.